When someone is terribly wronged, the immediate human instinct is to lash out. Most retaliation is messy, loud, and driven by blind emotion. People scream, they throw punches, and they make foolish mistakes because their brains are running purely on adrenaline and anger. The most lethal form of retaliation operates on a completely different frequency. It requires a terrifying, almost psychopathic level of composure to suppress that immediate rage. Smile at your enemy and wait. Imagine looking an abusive king in the eye and forcing a smile while choking down a sickening meal he prepared for you, solely to bide your time. Or standing completely still on a foggy morning and letting an expert marksman fire a bullet directly into your chest, just so you can guarantee your own return shot hits the mark. Suppressing the natural instinct to flee or fight back serves as a deliberate tactic. By mastering their physical and emotional responses, a victim strips their enemy of any defensive advantage and positions themselves for a devastating counterattack. In the year 600 BCE, King Astyages ruled the Median Empire from a fortress high above his subjects. His reign was plagued by dark, recurring nightmares. His spiritual advisors, the Magi, interpreted these dreams as a strict prophecy. His daughter's unborn child was destined to overthrow him and seize control of the entire empire. Astyages ordered his most trusted general, Harpagus, to take the newborn boy into the woods and kill him. Harpagus took the child, but he couldn't bring himself to commit the murder. Instead, he committed treason, handing the baby off to a local shepherd who secretly raised the boy as his own. 10 years later, the boy was brought before the king after fighting a local noble. Astyages recognized his own facial features in the 10-year-old and extracted the truth from the shepherd. He summoned Harpagus to the throne room, but instead of punishing him, Astyages feigned relief that his grandson was alive. He invited Harpagus to a grand royal banquet, asking him to send his own 13-year-old son ahead to the palace to play with the young prince. Harpagus complied, believing he had been forgiven. But as soon as the general's teenager arrived at the palace, Astyages ordered his soldiers to execute the boy. They chopped his body into pieces, roasted his flesh, and prepared it to be served at the feast. Later that evening, Harpagus sat at the king's table and unknowingly ate the roasted meat set before him. Once the meal was finished, attendants brought out a covered basket. When Harpagus lifted the lid, he stared down at the severed head and hands of his own child. Astyages flashed an evil grin, asking his general how he liked the food. In that exact second, Harpagus had a choice: attack the king and die instantly, or swallow the most horrific grief imaginable. Miraculously, he kept his composure, looked the tyrant dead in the eye, and coldly replied, "Whatever my king does pleases me." Harpagus took his son's remains home and spent the next few decades quietly plotting. The surviving grandson, Cyrus, grew up and eventually led a Persian rebellion against the Median throne. Astyages made the fatal error of putting Harpagus in charge of crushing the revolt. When the huge armies finally clashed, Harpagus kept a secret promise to Cyrus, ordering his forces to violently turn against the king's loyalist soldiers. Swallowing his initial, overwhelming urge to strike back at the dinner table was the down payment for Astyages' ruin. By absorbing that unimaginable pain in the moment, Harpagus bought himself the necessary timeline to systematically dismantle the tyrant's entire empire from the inside out. Over 2,000 years later, the exact same principle played out on the American frontier. In 1805, former Tennessee Senator Andrew Jackson engaged in a bitter feud with a man named Joseph Irwin over a botched horse race bet. Irwin's son-in-law, Charles Dickinson, stepped in to defend his family. Dickinson started a public smear campaign, publishing brutal insults in the local paper that labeled Jackson a worthless scoundrel and a coward. But he crossed a lethal line at a public party when he openly insulted Jackson's honor by mocking his wife, claiming she hadn't officially divorced her first husband before marrying Jackson. To bypass anti-dueling laws, the men met across the Kentucky border on May 30th, 1806. This spatial schematic explains Jackson's unhinged strategy. Knowing Dickinson was an expert marksman, Jackson decided to stand perfectly still and take the first bullet. From 24 feet apart, Dickinson fired, sending a heavy lead ball crashing directly into Jackson's chest. Blood immediately began pouring down the former senator's shirt. But incredibly, Jackson did not fall. He remained planted firmly on his feet. Dickinson lowered his gun in shock, forced by the rigid rules of dueling to stand perfectly still on his mark and await his fate. Pale and clutching his bleeding chest, Jackson slowly raised his pistol, aimed at his target, and pulled the trigger. The hammer fell, but the gun only clicked. It was a misfire. By the strict etiquette of the era, that misfire counted as Jackson's one allotted shot, and the duel was legally over. But Jackson refused to leave his enemy alive. In a blatant violation of honor and the law, he manually recocked his weapon, took aim a second time, and shot Dickinson square in the chest, killing him. Jackson carried that lead ball near his heart for the rest of his life, suffering from severe chronic pain. Enduring that acute, lethal physical agony was the calculated upfront cost he was willing to pay to guarantee Dickinson's permanent removal. Harpagus survived his king's wrath and lived to see Astyages overthrown. His calculated treason paved the way for Cyrus the Great to establish the massive Achaemenid Empire, a cultural powerhouse that conquered the ancient Middle East. Jackson survived his duel, despite a shattered rib and the bullet lodged permanently in his chest cavity. His brutal disregard for the rules earned him a terrifying reputation, but it didn't stop his political ascent, eventually leading him to the White House as the 7th President of the United States. Both men weaponized their own suffering to achieve victory. Harpagus deployed macro-patience, stretching his restraint across decades while serving the very man who murdered his son. Jackson utilized micro-patience, exerting total physical control over his failing body in a split-second window. The absolute most dangerous people in all of human history are rarely the ones who choose to angrily lash out immediately. They are the ones with the discipline to endure unimaginable torment today, calmly paying the price to guarantee your certain destruction tomorrow.